There are companies in your city right now that should have died 5 years ago. They're not thriving, they're not growing, they're barely breathing, but they're still here, paying employees, signing leases, filing quarterly reports. They exist in a state that's neither alive nor dead. The financial press has a name for them: zombie companies. And in 2025, there are more of them than at any point in modern economic history. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about why failure has become optional. In a normal economy, bad companies die. It's brutal, but it's supposed to happen. If your business can't generate enough profit to cover your debts, you either restructure, sell, or shut down. That cycle clears the wreckage and makes room for better ideas. But something fundamental broke in that cycle after 2008, and it broke even harder during the pandemic. Today, thousands of corporations are operating in what economists call insolvency limbo. They can't pay off their debt from actual earnings. They can only afford the interest on that debt, and even that's a stretch. And the longer this goes on, the weirder the consequences get. Let's define the term clearly. A zombie company is typically a firm that for 3 consecutive years earns less in operating profit than it pays in interest expenses. It's the corporate equivalent of paying your credit card minimum every month, while the balance quietly grows. Under normal conditions, banks and creditors would cut these companies off. They'd force bankruptcy, liquidate assets, recover what they could, and move on. That's how capitalism is supposed to self-correct. But we haven't had normal conditions for a very long time. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world dropped interest rates to nearly zero. The logic was simple: make borrowing cheap so companies can invest, hire, and grow. But cheap money doesn't just help good companies, it keeps bad ones alive. When interest rates are low, even a failing business can refinance its debt, roll over the loan, extend the timeline, survive another quarter. And if you can survive long enough, maybe conditions improve. Maybe a competitor fails first. Maybe you get acquired. Or maybe you just keep refinancing forever.
For a decade, that's exactly what happened. Zombie companies borrowed more to pay off old debts. They didn't need to be profitable. They just needed to be believable enough to get another loan. Then came the pandemic. Governments injected trillions into the economy. Central banks bought corporate bonds directly. Emergency lending programs kept companies afloat that would have collapsed in weeks. The goal was to prevent mass unemployment and economic catastrophe. It worked. Sort of. Unemployment stayed lower than expected, but the side effect was that even more zombies got a lifeline.
By 2023, estimates suggest that roughly 20% of publicly listed companies in advanced economies qualified as zombies. In some sectors, like retail and commercial real estate, that figure is even higher. In the United States alone, zombie firms account for nearly $2 trillion in corporate debt. Think about that. $2 trillion tied up in companies that aren't creating value. They're not expanding. They're not hiring aggressively. They're just existing, sustained by access to credit and the assumption that someone, somewhere, will keep lending. Japan saw this first. In the 1990s, after their asset bubble collapsed, Japanese banks refused to write off bad loans. They kept zombie companies on life support for years, terrified that mass bankruptcies would trigger a financial meltdown. Economists call it the lost decade. It became 2 lost decades. The West swore it learned that lesson, but here we are, watching the same movie in slow motion.
Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Zombie companies don't just waste capital. They actively hurt healthy businesses. Imagine you run a profitable, well-managed company in a competitive industry. You want to expand, hire more people, invest in new technology. Across town, there's a zombie competitor. They're losing money, but they're still operating, still selling products at unsustainably low prices because they're not worried about profit. They're worried about survival. You can't compete with that, not fairly. So you hold back. You don't expand as fast. You don't take risks. Growth slows across the entire sector. Multiply that across thousands of companies and dozens of industries, and you get what economists call productivity stagnation. Innovation slows. Wages stagnate. The economy grows, but weakly, unevenly, without the dynamism that's supposed to come from competition. It's capitalism with the destruction turned off. And without destruction, there's no creation.
The absurd part is that everyone knows this is happening. Investors know, regulators know, the companies themselves definitely know, but no one wants to pull the plug. Banks don't want to trigger defaults because it would damage their balance sheets and spook markets. Governments don't want mass layoffs right before an election. Executives don't want to be the ones who admit defeat, so everyone pretends. Quarterly earnings calls become performance art. Analysts nod along. Debt gets rolled over again. The music keeps playing. And now, in 2025, we've entered a new phase. Interest rates have finally gone up. After more than a decade near zero, central banks have raised rates to fight inflation. That's good for savers, but it's a nightmare for zombies. Suddenly, refinancing isn't cheap anymore. Suddenly, interest expenses are climbing. Companies that could barely cover payments at 2% rates are now staring at 6 or 7%. The math doesn't work anymore.
Some zombies are starting to collapse. You've seen the headlines. Retailers closing stores, tech startups running out of runway, commercial real estate developers walking away from buildings. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of them still aren't going bankrupt. Instead, they're finding new ways to survive. Private equity swoops in with rescue financing. Creditors agree to extend terms again, hoping to avoid a loss. Governments quietly provide subsidies under the banner of job protection. The zombies shamble forward. And this creates a strange kind of economic purgatory. We're not in a recession, exactly. Growth is still positive, unemployment is relatively low, but underneath the surface, capital is trapped. Resources are misallocated. The next generation of companies is struggling to get funding because so much money is locked up in keeping the last generation alive. Japan's lost decades weren't defined by dramatic crashes. They were defined by stagnation, by a slow, grinding sense that things weren't getting better. That's the real risk here. Not collapse, stagnation.
There's a deeper question buried in all of this. What happens to a capitalist system when you remove the consequences of failure? For decades, the implicit deal was this: take risks, and if you succeed, you win big. If you fail, you lose, but the system moves on. That's what kept things dynamic. Fear of failure forced discipline. The possibility of loss kept people honest. But if failure becomes theoretical, if zombie companies can persist indefinitely, what incentive is there to run a tight ship? Why cut costs aggressively? Why innovate urgently? You can just wait, refinance, survive, hope something changes. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. We've built an economy that's optimized for survival, not for vitality. An economy where the question isn't, are you building something valuable, but can you survive until the next loan? So the next time you walk past a storefront that's been going out of business for 3 years, or hear about a company that's been restructuring since 2019, or see a brand you thought was dead still running ads, remember this: they're not ghosts. They're zombies. And the scariest thing about zombies isn't that they exist, it's that no one's willing to let them die. The question isn't whether these companies will eventually fail. The question is how much of the economy they'll drag down with them while we wait.